Thank you so much for joining A Shark's Perspective, the podcast with subject matter experts in marketing. So, what is your big idea? The one that you're trying to convey that pulls your customers through a path, anchors them on what they want. What is the thread that makes your idea make sense in an order that people will understand? Tamsen Webster is part keynote speaker, part message strategist, full time idea whisperer on that big idea, and she's a subject matter expert in marketing and storytelling. On this episode, we'll speak about content, storytelling, big ideas, and the realization that as marketers, we don't have the power as kingmakers to make people do anything we want, but we can create the condition for that action. So let's listen in to someone who can pull some strings with a shark in some red waters on this episode of A Shark's Perspective. Tamsen, thank you so much for joining us on A Shark's Perspective today. If you would, please tell us a little bit about your background and your career thus far.
Sure. So, well, thanks for having me.
Absolutely.
My career thus far. Well, I'm a recovering marketer. I spent 20 years as a brand and message strategist, both in organizations and with agencies. About 4 years ago, I became the executive producer of TEDx Cambridge. So it's the largest locally organized TEDx event in the world. And that combined with the desire to really focus on the part of marketing I most loved, which was helping people and companies figure out how to make their ideas and their products and services as irresistible to people as they wanted and needed them to be. Started my own gig about 2.5 years ago, working with companies to do just that, how to build the stories behind their ideas so that those ideas can have the impact that they want.
So I also read about your experience as the executive producer with TEDx, and so many of us follow TED Talks. But what was life like with TED Talks and TEDx Cambridge?
Well, it was fantastic, exhausting, mind expanding, and just so rewarding all at the same time. So all TEDx's, as some people may know, are pro bono. So all that work that I was doing was outside of my normal day job, which was both when I had started my business, but before that, when I worked for a kind of small boutique sales message training company. And it was just marvelous, really, to be able to work with people on things that in many ways they had spent their entire life figuring out and working on, and just being able to help them pull out the power in those ideas in a way that other people could see, not just understand the idea, but really see what those ideas could do in the world and how they could take them and use them for themselves. And that part was just, nothing like it. And it's why I do the work I do now, is because it became such a rewarding part of my life that I wanted to be able to do that work all the time.
Yeah, it would be hard to go there and not be inspired by the day-to-day speeches you would hear.
Exactly.
So then let's get to the big idea of the podcast and the big story du jour. Tell us, if you will, a little bit about what the red thread story is.
So the red thread, well, by way of explanation, the red thread is an idiom, it's a phrase, a saying that is fairly common in Europe, but not so much here. I first heard it, but from a European client who used it in the context of really asking. They said, "Well, what's the red thread here?" And what they were saying was, "What's the thing that makes this make sense? What's the theme? What's the through line? What is the thing that holds this all together?" And I was so taken with this concept because that's the thing that we need to ask ourselves all the time if we're putting messages together or marketing or sales pitches or talks or presentations, of course. The people hearing it need to understand, what is it actually all about? And so I went exploring with where the phrase the red thread comes from. And it turns out that it comes from ancient Greek myth. It comes from the story of the Minotaur and the Labyrinth, and how Theseus, the young prince of Athens, finally figured out how to defeat both the Minotaur and the Labyrinth by using a ball of red thread that he unwound as he went into the labyrinth, so that after he killed the Minotaur, he could retrace his steps back out. So this idea of the red thread is the thing that runs through something, but it's also the thing that helps you understand how did you get where you are so that you can figure out where to go next. And that for me, as I was working with individuals and companies, essentially trying to do the same thing, trying to help them understand how did they get to the point of the brand that they have, or the idea that they have, or the message they were trying to share. By following those steps, we were actually able to recreate those steps as a way of helping other people understand and fall in love with those ideas as well.
I was fascinated by it after I heard you speak, and grabbed a Greek mythology book, and have been kind of hooked ever since, and probably even watched Clash of the Titans after, just watch the Minotaur.
Awesome.
But
I love that.
But part of the reason that I'm fascinated with this topic is because so many people, and I've heard this from other people, I've seen it myself as I've grown over my career, so many people have to sell up internally a big idea. And I don't necessarily mean it from a communication standpoint, but they have to create that groundswell and support. And articulating that can be a really difficult thing for a lot of people. So how do you take that red thread, from a high level, and then apply it to those big and bigger ideas? And what advice do you have for people that are trying to create that swell of opportunity, if you will?
Well, the first thing to understand is that all of us as humans make sense of information in the same way. There's these basic questions that we need to have answered in a basic order. And the problem is that when we have the answer to a question, let's say it is that idea that you're trying to sell up the chain of command, it's really tempting to just say, well, here's the answer. But that's not how people understand. And before somebody can really agree with something, before they really can take an action on it, they have to not only understand the idea, they really have to adopt it as their own. They have to reach the same conclusion that you did.
Exactly.
So, the thing that's tempting, as I said, is to just say, well, here's the answer. And the way that I sometimes illustrate this is to say, okay, imagine you go to a doctor's office and it's for a regular physical checkup. It's a new doctor. And before the doctor does any kind of examination on you, they say, so Kenneth, when would you like to schedule surgery? Now, most people would not sign up for that at that point, because there's a fundamental question in your head, and I'm guessing it's something along the lines of, why do I need this surgery? And in fact, that's always true. So if you present somebody with an answer, they need to understand, well, what is the question that this thing solves? What is the problem that I was not aware of that this is now the answer to? Now, so we have a solution now, that the answer, this idea that you want to sell up the chain of command. And now let's say you figured out that, okay, there's a problem. It's still not enough though. And a lot of times, I spend a lot of time in marketing messaging and in sales messaging, as I mentioned. A lot of times people say, well, as long as you can, spend enough time on the problem, then you'll get people to the solution. And that really hasn't been my experience, for the same reason that it doesn't work back in that doctor's office example. So if I were to say to you, so Kenneth, you've got a spot on your back, when would you like to schedule surgery? I've now satisfied the requirements of problem and solution. You have something that you didn't know about that you couldn't see, and I think it requires surgery. But I'm going to bet that there's still a question in your mind, which is, well, why is that spot such a problem? Like what has to be true about that spot in order for it to be something where you'd even remotely be willing to consider surgery? Well, here's the thing. It has to be something that makes it impossible for you to ignore that spot on your back. So it needs to be something that actually goes against something that you want. So I can't, for instance, say, hey, you know what? It's a piece of lint.
Right.
Do you want to schedule surgery? Because that doesn't make any sense. It has to be something like, well, it's got the characteristics of something that could be precancerous. So let's talk about what the options are. So these kind of three fundamental questions of why do I need the thing that you have? Second, I shortened it to what now? Like, what do I have to understand about this now in order for that problem to be a problem and for me to want and need to move? And then finally, how? Okay, now that I know those things, how do we need to proceed in order to solve it? These are questions that everybody needs, and they need them in that order. Mm-hmm. So, when at a very high level, if you're thinking about how do I take a message or an idea and I move it forward, we need to make sure that we have the specific answers to those questions and that you answer them in that order. Like, why do we need to do this right now? And that's going to be a combination of, because it's going to help us achieve a goal, which can be to, solve a problem or to answer a question that we're trying to get, to save more money, to make more money, whatever it might be. And because there's something that we didn't know about that's getting in the way of it. So that's the real problem. So a goal and a problem, that answers the question of why. And then this idea of, okay, well, what do we have to understand about that real problem in order for us to move forward to the next question? That's something I call the truth. And it needs to be something that people readily agree with, that makes that problem impossible to ignore. So, or it's a provable fact, right? So, back in that doctor's office, like if I were to show you a picture of the spot on your back and then show it to you next to something that is, was known to be precancerous, you would say, yeah, I agree. That looks similar. Let's explore. It has to be something that somebody would readily agree with. It makes that problem impossible to ignore. So you've got the why is answered by a real problem that gets in the way of the goal. The what now is answered by this truth, this kind of provable fact. And once you have those two answers, then you can present your solution. Then you can present your answer to how, which is kind of that change in approach that you're looking for. So those pieces all together, goal, and this is the, what are you trying to achieve? What's everybody in the room trying to achieve? The problem, the real problem that gets in the way, the truth that makes that problem impossible to ignore. Those three things add up to a fourth piece, which is the change, which is that high level of shift in thinking or behavior. And then the fifth piece, which isn't always required, but is almost always there at one level or another, are the actions that are required to make that change happen. So those 5 pieces are the pieces of the red thread. Those are the steps that you took to come to your own conclusion, the steps that you have to present to somebody else in order for them to come to the same conclusion.
Well, you forgot questions 6 and 7, which are, will my insurance cover this? And how much is my copay? So,
well, you know what? So that's hysterical. I love that. Well, that actually brings in another point, which is, a lot of times, a lot of the messaging that's out there about how to make your messages better focuses on the things that people need to hear in order to say yes to something. And those are fairly well known. I mean, people need to believe that something is possible, that it's possible to use your solution to solve my problem. I need to believe it's possible for me. Like it might be true for like that, let's say it's true for that manufacturing company over there, but I'm a biotech, so maybe it's different. So they need to believe that it's possible for them.
Sure.
And then the final thing is they need to believe it's worth it. So either the cost or the payoff, like that cost benefit ratio works out for them, or the barrier to trying it is so low that it works out. And a lot of people try to build their messages from those answers in the first place. And what I find over and over again is if you try to build a message from that, you end up with just this, you end up with what most people have right now, which is a list of features and benefits and why your stuff is awesome. You're like, yay, it's possible. Look, I can tell you a story, but unless they know why it's possible, back to the doctor's office, they're not going to go, okay, they're just going to see it and they're going to like, fine. Now, that's why it's so important to say it's possible for them. Okay. And that's where you need to do that work and say, well, how do I show that? And then the is it worth it piece. So the way I like to think about those 3 questions is they're a great check on a message you've developed some other way. They're a great way to go, all right, based on what I've shown them, will I get yeses to these 3 questions?
So then let's transition a little bit towards storytelling and content marketing, something I heard you offer additional advice on during your presentation, and I've seen in some of your newsletters. But what kind of advice and strategy do you generally give to clients when looking at the value of stories in your content marketing? And I'm sort of asking that question as I'm trying to weave that red thread throughout, So
yeah, absolutely. So the power of stories is something I mentioned kind of in passing a little bit earlier, and that is that stories are how we make sense of information. Mm-hmm. And the first time I heard that, I was like, I don't know. Like in my head, I'm not like, well, once upon a time, but what we are always looking for, and what we're always slotting into place are 3 key elements. And these are 3 elements that come from a very good friend of mine and an expert storyteller There's a wonderful blog called at storyhow.com, a guy named Ron Plouffe, Ploof, and he talks about stories as having three main components: roles, events, and influences. So roles are the who, events are the what happened, and the influences are why they happened. And the way that the human brain works is that whenever we're presented with a situation, we're trying to figure those pieces out. Like, who's going on, who are these people, what's going on, and why are things happening the way that they're happening. And before we can even consciously think about it, and this is why it's so important, your brain has already slotted things into those categories, and it started to make assumptions for itself. And there's great examples where you can give people, let's say, three random sentences, like totally random sentences. Like, so I went, once upon a time, I went into a random sentence generator, which they have online because they apparently have everything online. And you can get three random sentences. And these were the three sentences that I got. One was, Jennifer keeps the milk cold. The second sentence was, we called her the skinny singer. And the third sentence was, we found the box empty. Now, those were three random sentences. They have nothing to do with each other. And yet, I'm going to guess that you and other people listening were like, well, Jennifer's a skinny singer. Like, she drank the milk and the milk is now empty. So, like, she's a horrible person because she didn't replace the milk, right? So, like, and even if you didn't necessarily come to exactly that, your brain is, even if you know those are random sentences, as soon as you hear Jennifer keeps the milk cold, we called her the skinny singer, your brain goes, oh, Jennifer's a singer. And we called Jennifer that, and she's skinny. No, that's actually not what happened. That's not what I said, but that's what our brain does. So I say all that because this is both good news and bad news for us, is if you're trying to create content. So now the good news is that if you give people all the elements of story, they're automatically going to understand it better,
right?
In a better way. The bad news is, but there's hope here too, is that if you don't give them all the elements of the story, they will create their own, and it may not be the one that you want. And so this is why, the way that, why story and story structure and the red thread tie into each other is that each of those pieces of the red thread, the goal, the problem, the truth, the change, and the action, are essentially ways to help you figure out what are the pieces that somebody needs to hear in order to accurately construct the story that you want in their head. And, that came because, there's lots of information out there on how to tell stories. There's some great stuff. There's Joseph Conrad and the Hero's Journey. Sure. Nancy Duarte has done some great stuff. Donald Miller has done some great stuff with the story brand. And, what I found was, one of two things. A, it's either really complicated. It's hard for people to figure out, well, what's the rising action and the falling action? Or you can fill in all the pieces and still not have a story that works. Right. So I can have a story that, I could have, a character who wants something, and I can make sure there's a problem, and I can supply a guide who has a plan, and it could still be that nothing happens. So why is that? So the whole idea behind the red thread was to try to figure out, well, not just what are the pieces of a story, but why are those the pieces, and why are they in that order? Because the reason why they're in that order is for the reasons we were talking about before. That's how we make it make sense.
Sure.
So from a content marketing standpoint, stories, like if you're telling a story, like, once, there was a client, we had a client named, John, and John was trying to do this, but every day John was struggling with this aspect of his content marketing plan. He kept looking at it, as a series of individual pieces, and just could never figure out how to make it work. Well, we looked at that and we said, actually the way that we look at content marketing is not as a series of separate systems, but as actually a system of systems. We actually have to look at how all of these different pieces that you have in play work together. And that's because if only one piece is working, then the whole system doesn't work. If all of it works, then the whole goal will work. So what we did was we worked with John to make sure we were linking up his systems so that he got all the things he was looking for, and he was trying to get it through, and yay, it all finished out a good way. So that was not the best story, but at least fit
No,
the it
it
fit the
does.
category. So people go, oh, okay, now I understand. So you can use stories to make the stuff in your examples concrete. So you can say, oh, okay, I understand what you're saying to me conceptually, but people want a story. They want to understand how it works in real life. So you can use a story to do that. But what I found, and really the thing that helped me personally, and it seems to be the thing that really helps the clients that I work with who learn this process, who I teach this process in workshops and whatever, is that when you understand these pieces of the red thread, the goal, the problem, the truth, the change, and the action, even if you don't tell a story, it can help your information feel like a story to the person that's listening to it.
For sure.
And so it just ends up being much more interesting to them, much more understandable to them, much more engaging to them. And like everybody has a better time. You have a better time presenting it to them or writing it. They have a better time reading it, and everybody wins because everybody understands everything that much better.
So, one of the things that as a performance marketer, a lot of us often look too tunnel visioned on is looking at that direct action. And if you would, I know you spoke about driving action, but if you would tell us a little bit about how you think storytelling can drive actions, and I don't mean necessarily from an attribution standpoint, but wherever the reader, consumer, prospect, etc. is, what do we need to do to truly inspire that action upon that story and content? And what can someone expect, or what kind of goal should somebody expect when looking for action upon that?
Yeah, no, I love how you frame that. Well, the first and most important thing to understand is that we can't actually make people do anything. I'm really adamant about that because a lot of the work that I do ventures into persuasion and influence, and then it's a question people have in their minds
So
of like,
true.
well, how do I keep from manipulating people? And I was like, well, first of all, you can't make anyone do anything. Second of all, it's why I am so insistent that when I'm talking with people and when I'm working with people, that we're starting from the point of view of the person that you're trying to create a desire for action in, like your audience. You need to start with them and what they're looking at and what they care about. Now, the reason why you start with them is because while we can't make somebody change, we can't create change, we can't actually create action, we can create the conditions for it. We can create a situation where it's likely that they will think and see the situation differently. And if we can get someone to see something differently, we can oftentimes they will do something differently afterwards. And for the simple reason that one of the guiding truths of humans is that how we see the world drives what we do in it. Full stop. Like if you enter a situation thinking that it's a dangerous situation, you're going to behave in a way that's really super cautious. If you walk into a situation and feel totally safe, everything about your actions, your body language, and all that are going to reflect that. And this is true no matter where you look at it. So when it comes to creating the conditions for change, we have to understand, well, so what are some of these guiding conditions of how we see the world? And the first is, now it should start to sound familiar, things that we want, the goals that we have. There's a reason why all great stories start with a quest. All great stories and everything that we have as humans, back to like Ron and his influences, start because we want something. We want to gain something, we want to avoid losing something, but we want something. So that's a goal. Now, the reason why it's a condition and it drives how we see and therefore what we do is because you don't readily unwant a thing that you want. So you saw me speak, that cake weighs heavily in my presentations. I use an example of cake and my love for it and how it got in the way of my desire to lose weight 20 years ago.
Right.
But think about it. Like if I love cake, and I do, when someone told me like, don't eat cake, like, well, that's not going to happen because I can't readily unwant a thing that I want. And that's why it's so important that we anchor on something that somebody wants, because they're not going to readily unwant it. That's why it's a condition of how we see. Now, the second element of how we see is how we're looking at a situation, the perspective that we take. Again, we're going to look at it and say, is this a safe situation? Is this a dangerous situation? And so that perspective is, that's a guiding condition, because again, back to what I already said, the how we see drives what we do. And the third piece that is part of this kind of condition to change goes back to values and beliefs. Why do we think that certain things are true? And therefore, this matches up to the red thread piece with the truth. So we've got these two things. We've got the goal, and we've got the belief. And what those two things have, and the truth, I should say, the thing that those two things have in common is that neither of them moves quickly. So just like you don't unwant a thing that you want, you don't unbelieve a thing that you believe. So if you believe, I don't know, take a baseball example, that Pete Rose deserves to be in the Hall of Fame, or you don't, whatever side of that you might be on, you're not going to readily unbelieve it, right? That's not going to happen. So we've got these two things that don't move quickly: goals, truths. And one thing that is true for people, but it does have the possibility of moving, and that's how they're looking at a situation, that perspective. Now, the fact that it can be something that moves quickly, that's where all the hope comes in. And this is why we can have hope about how do we create the conditions for change, because we can create the conditions under which someone is very, very likely to at least consider a different perspective on a situation. And now this is all, conceptual right now, but the example that I know you saw, Kenneth, was, I love to use one that most people are familiar with, and that is what happens in all of our collective minds the minute that De Beers Diamonds unleashed their tagline onto the world of diamonds are forever. So if you think about it through the lens of what we've already talked about, so we have a goal. The goal of their potential customers is to have a symbol of their commitment. People are getting engaged, they want to give or receive a ring. That's a symbol of their commitment. And the perspective up until the point where that tagline came out was that, well, it's the ring. The ring matters. The ring is the symbol of the commitment. And De Beers' perspective on that same thing is well, yeah, the ring matters, but the kind of ring actually matters a lot too. And so this gap between how people see it and how they could see it creates the problem of perspective. And now we've got two of the pieces of our red thread again. We've got a goal, we've got a problem of perspective, an incomplete perspective. And so this is where the truth comes in. The truth comes in of a diamond is forever. And what we're talking about before, it's a statement that most people would readily agree with. It's demonstrably true. You don't have to be really convinced of it necessarily. Engineers always argue with me about whether or not a diamond is truly forever. I know it's not, but for all intents and purposes, it is. And now you see what we've done is we've created, with that introduction of that truth, we've created the condition for change. Why? Because if somebody, remember, they're not going to unwant a thing that they want. So they still want to symbol their commitment. They're not going to unbelieve something that they believe. So they're not going to suddenly unbelieve that diamonds are forever. Again, you might argue with that, but you're not going to unbelieve it. But if you consider both of those things to be true, then it becomes impossible for you, just about impossible for you, to ignore now that the kind of ring also matters, right? Because you're not going to say to someone, well, honey, the stats aren't great on this whole marriage thing, so I'm going to give us a 50-50 chance and we're going amethyst because I'm not so sure about forever. It's not going to happen. So this is really, in my mind, this is the secret to everything. It's the secret to creating a condition for change. And I like to call these green light moments. And I call them a green light moment because it's the moment where you're at an intersection, you've got a couple different ways to go. The light changes green. And it's that moment's everything, because that's the moment between having a choice and making a choice. And if you've created the conditions in that way that I've talked about, where you take something that they want and something that they believe and you put it in a battle with how they're looking at the situation, most of the time, how they're looking at the situation will change, and their mind will be open to doing something different. And doesn't mean they always will, but you've likely given them something that they can't unhear. And this is why diamonds still have such power over us. Even if I tell you, and I just did, exactly why that worked, you can't unhear it. You're like, yeah, but yeah, but the diamond is forever. Okay, I know it was a tagline, but like I want the symbol to be forever, so I'm still going to go for a diamond. Like you can't unhear it.
Right.
And that's really what you need to do when we're creating this kind of conditions for change. Like to get that green light moment, you have to give somebody something they can't unhear. And the likeliest and the most powerful way to do that is to give them 3 things that they believe to be true, one of which is weaker than the others.
Mm-hmm.
And that's almost always how they see a situation. And if you can get that to change for all the reasons we talked about before, almost always everything else will fall in line behind it.
So the moral of the story is dopey guys trying to marry up should shop at De Beers.
Maybe.
Maybe.
Yes.
Well, I think it's a brilliant comment about, people taking for granted and just thinking that we can just automatically, as marketers and kingmakers, get whatever we want. And, the whole part about just inspiring, creating that environment for people is I just think it's spot on. So
Yeah, it allows us to, I think it allows us to do a couple of things. One is, I just think it ends up being so helpful from a clarifying standpoint about what it is that you can actually do. Now that might, at some level say, well, oh gosh, no, I can't go out there and say that I can absolutely do this. And I can absolutely, drive these changes in the marketplace. No, but you can actually do something much, much more powerful, and you can change the way people see.
Yep. Keeps
And
you from
then
taking your customers for granted and helping earn their
absolutely.
business.
Because there's a huge difference. There's an ocean of difference between driving an action, which you can force, and creating a change in somebody. You can, by force, by command, by authority, by, an offer that's just too good to pass up, you can make somebody do something once.
Mm-hmm.
But how do you get them to keep doing it? How do you create a self motivating engine in their mind? The only way to do that sustainably over time is to change how they see without making that a hard decision for them. This is why, what we end up doing so often in marketing and in sales is that we try to get people to want something that they don't want or don't yet want,
Mm-hmm.
or we try to get them to believe something they don't yet
So
believe.
true.
It's the hardest thing that you can do. It's the hardest thing that you can do. So, it's so funny because when I started to, you were asking about the story of the red thread and how do we come to this, it really became a reverse engineering of things that I knew intuitively to be true when I spent all that time in marketing and brand strategy. I was like, it was hard to try to get people to go to think a different thing about, a fully different thing. Like I couldn't get somebody to suddenly want to give money to Harvard, because they don't think Harvard needs money. I mean, and that was my job. My job for 3 years was to be the person who was in charge of the fundraising strategy, the communication strategy behind the fundraising at Harvard Medical School. Well, you can't, I can't suddenly make people want to give. I can't just be like, well, give money, because that's the equivalent of saying, when do you want to schedule surgery?
Sure.
And kind of trying to get them to say, well, I suddenly want to give money to one of the most wealthy, one of the wealthiest institutions in the world. The other thing is that I can't suddenly get them to believe something they don't believe. And I can't get them to believe that Harvard needs money, because it doesn't. So the only thing that I could do was to get people to change how they were looking at the situation. So I could operate within something that I knew that they wanted, which was, if they were, somebody who was of a charitable giving mindset, that, I knew what they wanted was they wanted to have the biggest impact with that gift, no matter what size of gift it could be. I think you could say that no matter what. They didn't have to be a current donor to Harvard for that to be true. When you give money, whether it's $25 to your local ASP, SPCA, or, if whatever it is, or if it's 25 million to, a university, you want that gift to have the biggest impact it can have. Now, so what's the next thing that I could introduce? What is a perspective? And then, okay, well, the problem of perspective, we could look at it saying, well, there's um, Harvard doesn't need money, and that's the thing that's getting in the way. And this is where we could create a different perspective that said, well, it's not so much about kind of getting to a point where you need something. It's in fact what happens with the money. Like, it's not the why of the money, it's the what of the money. And that's where I could use something that operated on a belief that people already had, which is Harvard has more money than it possibly could know what to do with. And I could use that to create a different scenario. So here's what I mean. I could say, listen, you're right, potential donor. We don't need the money to keep the lights on. We don't. That is a benefit of Harvard having the amount of wealth that it does. And yet what that means is, even though there are still certain questions that we haven't had answered, as far as science and medicine goes, it means that when you do give us money, it can go that much further to accomplishing whatever it is that you're trying to accomplish. Because you don't have to think about it like the first 90% of every dollar, 90 cents of every dollar is going just to keep us open. Former, donors for years and years before you have done that. Your gift is now going much more quickly to having the impact that you're looking for. And so you see, by just operating within things they already believe, you make that shift much easier. And yet that is not what we try to do with marketing and sales. So often we're trying to do the opposite. We're trying to get them to want a new thing, or want a thing that they don't currently want, or get them to believe a thing they don't currently believe. But the answer is really simple. And that is just to use the things that they already want and they already believe, in the favor of getting them to see that what you offer already meets those criteria for them.
Well, Tamsen, it's now time to ask you the 5 most important questions of the day. Are you ready?
Oh, okay, yes.
All right. To a Bostonian, Red Sox or Red Thread?
Oh gosh, I'm gonna combine that, because the Red Sox are part of the red thread of Boston. They are a beautiful embodiment of the spirit of this city, its highs and lows, its desire to win, its championship of the everyman, and the willingness to welcome people from the outside, as long as they're all fighting for the same thing, which is the glory of the Red Sox.
You sound like you're a professional politician. That was a perfect answer.
Oh, I love my Red Sox.
I'm going to take an impromptu question based off of your mention of Diamonds Are Forever. Sean Connery or Daniel Craig?
Oh, that's tough. I have to say,
and don't judge Daniel Craig on the carrying the baby.
No, nor will I judge him on Quantum of Solace, which was not a great film. I have to go Daniel Craig, though. I think he is the James Bond of our times. I love how gritty he is. I love that he's not perfect. I love that there's humor there, but it's not. It's not kind of like the Roger Moore, like
Agreed.
campy humor that we had. And while Sean is the classic, I would say that I would go for Daniel Craig every time.
Fair enough. Now, I think I know the answer to this based off of one of your presentations. Boston Marathon or New York Marathon?
Oh, Boston. Yeah. Well,
congratulations
I ran it twice.
on running it. So.
Yeah, and I ran it in 2013, the year that it got bombed too. So that it will always have a place in my heart.
Hard to follow up that response with this question, but chocolate cake or red velvet cake?
Actually they're the same.
Food coloring.
Right, exactly. A red velvet cake is actually a chocolate chiffon cake. I do love, and it's because if I had to choose any cake, I actually love carrot cake and cream cheese frosting, which is probably why I would say that red velvet has the edge, because it does have that chocolate, but it almost always has this awesome cream cheese frosting on it as well. So the cream cheese tilts it towards red velvet.
Gotcha. So number 5 question, whether you travel through the Midwest or the South, or you've ever visited a Cracker Barrel. This is the most important answer you'll ever give. Biscuits or cornbread?
Oh my God. And I've never, this is shocking and sad. I've never actually been to a Cracker Barrel. But my answer, not based on Cracker Barrel's offerings, is clear. I am a biscuit girl 100%.
Yeah. I don't know. I was trying to think which one might go better with New England clam chowder. So,
Oh,
Well,
biscuit, like just
just
biscuits, like
biscuits.
biscuits. I love biscuits. Yeah.
Well, Tamsen, thank you so much for taking the time to join us on the show today. Where can people find out more about you, your expertise, follow your advice and thoughts, get the newsletter?
It is all at tamsenwebster.com. So there you can find the things that I speak about and do workshops on, the consulting that I do, but also on my slash content page. You'll see all the videos that I post every week and the blog posts that I write every 2 weeks, and you can sign up for my newsletter.
Awesome. Thank you, Tamsen, so much for joining us on A Shark's Perspective.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me and seeing how storytelling can help your listeners' messages. I'm happy to be of use.
You bet. So there was my conversation with Tamsen Webster, the part keynote speaker, part message strategist, full-time idea whisperer on that big idea, who's also a subject matter expert in marketing and storytelling. Let's take a look at 3 key takeaways from my conversation with her. First, so what is the red thread? What's the thing that makes this make sense? We need to ask ourselves this in what we do in our marketing messaging and ads and presentations and stories. When you unwind the string, make sure it runs through something and helps you get where you are so you'll know where to go next. How do you get to the point of the brand that you have? Second, all of us make sense of information in generally the same way. There are basic questions that we need to have answered in a basic order. When we have the answer to a question, it's really tempting to say, well, here's the answer. But that's not how people understand. Before someone can really agree with something or take an action on it, they have to not only understand the idea, they have to adopt it as their own. They have to reach the same conclusion that you did. Great points from Tamsen. I love the idea of when the doctor walks in and tells you that you need surgery without an explanation as to why you need it. We need more information whether we're trying to communicate or understand that big idea or solution. Think about it too. Are you doing the same thing with your marketing messaging? Why do I need what you're selling? Why do I need it now? And how is your product or service the solution that solves it? People need that information in that order. Third, if you're trying to create content, the good news is that if you give people all the elements of a story, they're automatically going to understand it better and in a better way. The bad news is if you don't, well, then the reciprocal thing happens. They create their own vision and it may not be the one that you want. It's essential that you help people place the pieces of the puzzle together correctly. I mean, look at your content and ask, what are the pieces of the story and why are they pieces? Stories should work together and have some commonality and a red thread. Deconstruct your stories and help your reader, your listener, your consumer understand the goal, the problem, the truth, the change, and the action. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this show regarding another one of the many components that makes up marketing today. Got a question? Please feel free to find me on LinkedIn or send me an email to kenneth@asharksperspective.com. It's been my honor. I think you have a powerful story. Just find your own red thread and go focus on the part of marketing that you most love, and join us on the next episode of A Shark's Perspective.